2024 tabletop role-playing game Ask Me Anything with the OGGM and Steve the Cat on this very weird weather day. It is not gray outside. It is not sunny outside. It's just green and overcast. Green. Yep, it's about 9 o'clock in the morning on this, the 20th day of December, 2024. The year is rapidly coming to an end. I still don't have 2,000 followers. Shame on all of you. And we're doing this thing. Well, we're doing a version of this thing where we talk about if my opinions changed since this time last year. What is my favorite? What is my least favorite? And apparently we're doing an edition wars. This is... Yeah, a couple other video tubers like Professor Dungeon Master have talked about the edition wars and which edition and when and what and whatever. So I guess we need to do what is my favorite edition, and boy, is my answer going to piss you off. Now, I assume you mean what is my favorite edition of Dungeons and Dragons. And then, of course, we have to go, well, how many editions are there? Because there's either 6 or 12 or 21. So, but I assume you mean of the 6. So, or are we talking about a different game? You know, because there's lots of other games I played besides D&D, and most of them have had more than one edition. So I don't know. But let's start with my favorite edition of Dungeons and Dragons. And oh boy, this is going to piss off somebody, because the answer is all of them. All of them. Every edition of Dungeons and Dragons that had something I liked and something I didn't like. And when I was playing those, they were always fun. So when I was playing 0 edition White Box, that was the most fun. That was my favorite. When I was playing 1st edition or AD&D or Red Box or whatever you want to call it, that was the most fun at the time. So that was my favorite edition. When we switched to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition or Complete Roll or Holmes Basic or BECME or whatever you want to call that time period, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition, that was my favorite because that's what we were playing. A large chunk of my gaming history was AD&D. That was when I was, the beginning of TJ Storm's Company of the Bull campaign. So obviously that was my favorite edition. Then we switched to 3rd, favorite edition. We switched to 3.5. I hated the fact we had to switch, but it was the beginning of, what Wizards of the Coast was going to be up to regularly. But we played 3.5 forever and a day, favorite edition. We switched to 4th, favorite edition. When we jumped from 4th to Pathfinder, that was my favorite edition. When we jumped from Pathfinder to 5th edition, that was my favorite edition. 5th edition was my favorite edition of Dungeons & Dragons, all the way up to Wizards of the Coast started ruining it. And then I was like, there are retro clones that do this better. And as for 6th edition, well, since I'm probably never going to play it, it probably won't be my favorite edition. So my favorite edition right now is what I'm playing right now, and that's Shadow Dark. Well, modified Shadow Dark. So really, whatever edition I'm playing at the time is my favorite edition. And it's the best edition because I'm playing it. And if I'm playing it and I'm enjoying it, it's the best edition. Whatever edition of whatever game you're playing at the time, it's the best because you're playing it right now. If you go around spouting how, well, no, the 2nd edition of Villains and Vigilantes is better than the current edition of Villains and Vigilantes, then why aren't you playing that version? Whatever edition you're playing now is the best because you're playing it. And I'm assuming you're having a good time because otherwise you wouldn't be playing it. You'd go and find another game. Unless you're that 1% of people who can't get out of the mindset that Dungeons and Dragons is the only game to play. And every answer to every question I have regarding Dungeons & Dragons will be resolved with Dungeons & Dragons because there's no other games that do the job as good or if not better. But unless you're that one small percent, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of variations of D20 level-based fantasy and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other games that approach the same basic philosophy experiment that we've been doing from 50 years in whole sorts of new different ways. D6s, percentiles, D20s, D10s, D8s, D4s, D12s, D32s. Don't use dice at all. We use cards. We don't use dice at all. We use apps on their phone. We don't use dice at all. We use a Jenga board. We don't use dice at all. We just, base the game on rainfall, the tossing of rocks, random chicken legs. I don't know. I don't know what you're doing and how you're playing out there. But if you're playing a game, and if you're enjoying the game you're playing, that's the best edition. So that's my favorite edition. So right now, my favorite edition of D20 level-based fantasy is Shadow Dark, because that's what I'm playing. But I'm also in a semi-regular 5th edition game, but that only happens like 4 times a year now, 5 times a year now, when we can all get our schedules together and do it. And it's online, so it's not really as my favorite, but it's definitely one of my favorites. When we played Pathfinder every week, that was my favorite. So really, my favorite edition is, what is the best edition of Dungeons & Dragons? I don't know. Every one of them has something really, really good, and every one of them has something really, really bad. And for every argument you can find for how good the system is, you'll find an equal amount of people telling you how bad it is, except 4th. But there's people who like 4th. There's people who love 4th. I thought 4th had some great stuff in it. 4th was a lot of good ideas, just handled badly. That's a whole separate vlog, but so we go. Now, as for other game systems that I've played, I mean, the second game that I've played the most, I don't know, I haven't figured out the math yet because I'm dumb, whether I actually have played more Villains and Vigilantes than Dungeons and Dragons, or if I've played more Dungeons and Dragons than Villains and Vigilantes. Because remember, there's a huge chunk of my time where all I was playing was Villains and Vigilantes, but then there was also a huge chunk of my time where all I was playing was Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and then 3rd edition. So yeah, I mean, I guess TJ's 15 years of the same D&D game, that probably wins. So that was probably my favorite. I mean, we're just doing time periods. Playing TJ Storm's Company of the Bull was my favorite D&D. When I was running my Freeport campaign for 9 years straight, that was my favorite D&D. As for other game systems that have devoted a large amount of my time, my favorite edition of Villains and Vigilantes, this one I can be very specific, it's the 2nd edition. The 2nd edition of Villains and Vigilantes by Jeff D. and Jack Herman is my favorite. It's probably the best of all the editions of Villains and Vigilantes. It's the one that gets its closest to right. If you mash together Villains and Vigilantes 2nd edition and the description of stuff from Heroes Unlimited, you have as close to as perfect a superhero role-playing game that does D20 level-based as you can get. That's the dream superhero game I'm always trying to create, and I never quite get right. It's combining the best of Villains and Vigilantes with the best of Heroes Unlimited. And I'll keep trying, and I'll keep not getting it right. Every superhero game I've designed, even when I was working on GURPS. Hey, when I was working on GURPS, it was my favorite edition. I loved GURPS until they ruined it. And I loved writing for GURPS. When I was writing for Artisolian Cyberpunk and doing Cyber Generation, that was my favorite. Mom, there was like a 2-year chunk where I wanted to try and convert everything to the interlock system, which probably led to the invention of Fusion. Oh, yeah. I helped with the creation of Fusion. Who remembers Champions of the New Millennium? I do, because I helped create that. Not my proudest moment, but hey, Fusion was a good idea that just didn't work. But there was a large chunk of time where I was like, I can crash the interlock system into any genre and make it work. No, you can't. So yeah, I mean, favorite edition is whatever I'm playing now. And whatever edition I love now. What's the favorite edition of the games I've written? Well, most of them were written for Wretched. So yeah, but now I'm writing them for Shadow Dark or just D20 Basic. So yeah, and whatever game I write my sys stuff for next year or create my own, people are now saying, you should create your own system. And I'm like, no, why? It's been done. There's nothing I could come up with system-wise that hasn't already been done. Why not just continue to make supplements for an existing system rather than try and make my own? Does anybody want to see me make my own tabletop role-playing game system? Do you think the OGGM tabletop role-playing game system would be any way, shape, or form better than the stuff that's already on the market? There are no original ideas. There's just ways to layer them. I mean, when they said, we're using Jenga as a way to determine the outcome of the role-playing games. I was like, well, that's freaking brilliant. That's a first. I mean, What am I going to do? The OGGM tabletop role-playing game based on Twister. I came up with the tabletop role-playing game rules for life. the board game. Niels Born. No, there's systems. It's just finding the right system that lets me do what I want to do. Shadow Dark is easily hackable for almost everything. It's got the best, of 5e. It's got the best of the level-based Gygaxian D20 fantasy. I can make it dark and grim. I can make it, normal. I can make it high power and goofy. And it still has that basis combination of D20 level-based Gygaxian goodness and 5e, Mike Merle's 5e fantasy goodness. So either way, so Shadow Dark, and it's easily hackable. So that's what I'm playing right now. So that's my favorite. Now, if we're going to go my favorite games of all time, well, you should already know that pecking order. And I'm sure my pecking order should also probably piss off a few people because you're going to notice what game is not very ranked very high. Surprisingly, Dungeons & Dragons is not my favorite game of all time, even though it has made up most of my life. No, my favorite game of all time is superheroes role-playing games. And in the superhero role-playing game pantheon, it's Marvel superheroes, villains and vigilantes, everything else. GURPS Supers because I wrote it. Champions because it is but it's too complicated for me. It's Marvel FASERIP, but not because of the system. I've told you guys this story hundreds and hundreds of times. But yeah, Marvel FASERIP, but it's not my Desert Island role-playing game. We'll get to that list in a second. Villains and Vigilantes, everything else. And then D&D is in my top 10, but it's not number one. Now, lately, we've been doing the end of the year Desert Island role-playing game. Like if you could only take one, if you could only take three, which ones would you go if the apocalypse was like, if you were trapped on a desert island, what could you take with you? Which is like, well, if I'm trapped on the desert island, why would I have had a role-playing game with me? Did I know ahead of time I was going to be trapped on the desert island? Because if I'm just going on a trip and then the plane crashes and I end up on a desert island, I probably didn't take a role-playing game with me on the trip. But basically, I don't need any rules, right? As long as I have something, a piece of paper and a pencil and something to write stuff down on, or a way to, I don't even know if you need a piece of paper and a pencil to run a role-playing game. As long as you have something that to generate random numbers, everything else is just cooperative storytelling, right? I don't really need any system. All I need to do is find a rock that has, 2 or more sides. That's my random number generator. Then people just tell me what it is they do, and then we use something else to determine life points. Like, okay, you start the game with 4 pebbles. And then when you level up, you get an extra pebble. And that's how we determine life. You tell me what you do. I throw the rock. If the rock comes up on one side, you succeed. If the rock comes up on the other side, you fail. There you go, right? If I could only take one tabletop role-playing game system with me, like if we're going into the apocalypse bunker, and they're like, you can only bring one, so just bring one tabletop role-playing game. You can only bring the dice you need to bring that tabletop role-playing game. What would it be? And you can only bring one. Well, what tabletop role-playing game system would allow me to do every type of scenario I could think of with the minimal amount of work? So basically, it breaks down to which dice is easier to find. So we're either doing percentile-based or D6, because probably the easiest dice to find is D6, right? So a D6 dice pool system is probably the easiest game. If I could only bring one, I would probably bring a D6 dice pool system like West End Games D6 Star Wars, because I would be able to easily pocket D6s. They don't take up a lot of room. You could find 6-sided dices everywhere. Every board game has 6-sided dice in them. You can find just loose packs of 6-sided dice in the card game section. Fuck, you walk into any liquor store, and usually behind the counter with the cigarette stuff, there's that random weird pack of 6-sided dice for Yahtzee or whatever. So yeah, number one would probably be a D6 system. Number two would be a D6 system and a percentile system. So I'd be bringing Basic Role-Playing by Chaosium, and the West End Games D6 system. Pretty much I could run any game I could think of with those two. If I'm allowed 3, well, then I'm just bringing a level-based D20 system with me. And that would just be what level-based D20 system takes the least amount of room that I can print out or I have that takes up less than 10 pages. So either that would probably be, right now it would probably be either Project Black Flag, the SRD, or the Shadowdark SRD, or just any SRD D20 level base. With those 3, I could run anything. If I've only got 1, then I'm like, what game will I most likely be able to find dice for? Is it going to be easier for me to find ways to generate 1 through 100, or is it going to be easier for me to find 6-sided dice? And let's face it, if push comes to shove, again, it's easier for me to find 6-sided dice anywhere on the planet than any other dice. So if I could only bring 1, it's the D6 dice pool system. And, my personal favorite being West End Games, but I could also do the Year Zero system from Free League, except, your typical Year Zero book is 300 pages, and your typical West End Games D6 book is 26 pages. So, yeah. I mean, I'm looking right now on my shelf, and I'm looking at 2 of the 3, and I'm like, yeah, I'd grab that one, and I grab that one, and I grab my dice, and that's all I need. So, what is your favorite game of all time? What is your favorite edition of all time? What is your nuclear bunker desert island game? Like, you could only bring 1. I know Shadow and Sons is Villains and Vigilantes. You let me know what you're thinking. What is your edition? How many people are pissed off by my answer? We know somebody's going to be like, oh, the OG GM doesn't know what he's talking about. The best edition was Dungeons & Dragons 7.4. It was that one edition that came out for 20 minutes. That's it. That's the best edition. The OG GM doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a two-faced. Yeah, we know somebody's going to be upset about this. So just enjoy it. Just enjoy it. There we go. Ask me anything. What questions would you like me to answer? What questions would I like to ask you? That's it. There you go. Have a great day. Stay safe out there. The weather here in Site B is weird. Again, it's green. I don't know what that means, but probably nothing good. See ya.
News from the table in the rolling waves. Dice in our hand, we're the dungeon's brave. Then